prevail over death. And we find that when we are in a contest of this kind, a serious warfare game of this kind, and we take it seriously, we are involved in it in a very deep and bitter sense. Now, the difference of Buddhism from science as a form of knowledge is that in Buddhism it would be said that this view of things, this view of the task of life as making order triumph over disorder, leaves something out. You remember right at the beginning I made some importance of a Sanskrit word which is fundamental in Buddhism, avidya. Avidya, which meant a means non, vidya, knowing. Non-knowing or ignorance, or better, ignorance. Ignorance, in other words, leaving something out of account. And I want to use a familiar illustration to show in what way we ignore. You see here a figure which is apparently, as you look at it, two faces in profile about to kiss each other. Now, if we draw back a little from those two faces, we can see on the white area in between them the form of a cup. But the interesting thing about this is that as you look at it, you will either be able to see the form of the cup or the form of the two faces in profile, as it were, about to kiss each other. You can alternate them between them very rapidly, but you will not be able to see them both that way at the same time. In other words, either the white must be the background and the black the figure on the ground, or else the black must be the background and the white cup showing up on it. And so in this way, we are unable to see, really, we can think it. After a while, we can get accustomed to the idea that the figure and the ground, the black and the white, are mutually necessary to each other. In that figure that I showed you, you could say both the cup with the stem and the two faces are there. But our ideas about them, our concepts, are mutually exclusive, and we cannot see them both at the same time. And in the same way, in this figure that I drew, we either see the sawn-off stumps or the bear claws. It's difficult to see this figure both ways at the same time. And so, also, just as we see one and not the other, so we identify ourselves. After all, when you're looking at the white figure in that illustration, which is the cup, you, as it were, identify with the cup. When you look at the two faces, you identify with the profile. So in the same way, when we experience the world around us, we identify with the subject, the knower. We don't identify with what we see. But as a matter of fact, if there is nothing seen, there is no experience of a seer. If there is no seer, there is no experience of anything seen. They both go together in the same way as the black and the white. And this idea that the yes and the no, the black and the white, the inside of a class, say we draw a square as representing fundamentally the idea of class. I can't have a square which doesn't have both inside and outside. They go together. And in Buddhism, this going together is called shunya. Although this is often translated void, it means that the inside of the square cannot exist, is void without the outside, the subject without the object, the black without the white. And this, of course, is represented in this fundamental Chinese figure of the yang or the positive principle and the yin or the negative principle, like two fishes constantly circulating, going round and round and round and round in the alternations of life. Now, the question is, are these two fishes involved in a fight? Is the white one eating up the black one and the black one trying to eat up the white one? If that is the situation, then of course life is fundamentally nothing but a grim contest. If this one up here is the good fellow and this one is the bad fellow, if this is order and this is chaos, then a fight goes on between them. And that's largely the way in which our technology has interpreted man's situation as against nature. This is man, the white, the good fellow. This is nature, the dark, the bad fellow. And the white one has got to eat him up. But what happens if the white fish succeeds in eating up the dark fish? The white fish disappears as well as the dark one, because the white one is only there in relation to the dark. So then, if these two fishes, as it were, wake up, if this one wakes up and this one wakes up, which is called awakening in Buddhism, they realize they're one. In other words, they go together. They're inseparable from each other. And this realization is that experience, which is called in Zen Satori, or in Buddhism, Bodhi, awakening. This sudden dawning on our consciousness that life is not really a contest to make yes triumph over no, to make the positive triumph over the negative. The two sides go together. And then one sees in this strange way that underlying all that is negative in the world, all that is in a way painful and evil, there is a kind of necessity to it. It goes with the good. It is necessary for the good. Disorder is necessary for the manifestation of order, just as you must have, say, a black background to show up a light figure. And then when one sees that, a profound transformation takes place in one's attitude to the world. That is to say, instead of looking upon life as a contest, it becomes a dance, it becomes a game. One doesn't withdraw from it, one doesn't stop living, but one goes into the game so that these revolving fishes are no longer trying to eat each other, but they're just going around dancing, having the biggest fun in the world. So then, must we have fixed in our minds the idea that all the forms and patterns of nature are simply methods of attack or defense, that they're devices for camouflage, that they're simply lures for sexual attraction or other utilitarian purposes? Or can we see in them a dance, a joyous cosmology?
I've been talking about the perception of the world coming suddenly out of nothing. You'll remember that in a previous talk, I asked you to close your eyes and listen. And you would hear silence and then sounds coming right out of that silence. And then I suggested that you use your eyes and see light, shape, form, coming at you as a vibration that is proceeding out of space. And I pointed out that our logic resists that because we say, you can't get something out of nothing. And that we normally think of all the energetic manifestations of this universe as coming out of the past. We think the things that were there already are producing the things that are going on now. But I was trying to get you to look at it in the other way, so that you would see the whole world starting now instead of in the past, and the past as a kind of echo, fading away into memory, and I illustrated it as being like the wake of a ship that trails across the water and then fades out. But the wake is started by the ship in the present. And so in the same way, I'm moving on to the uncommonsensical idea of the world as a production of energy that is beginning right now and is coming out of the nothing that we variously call space and silence. But then, naturally, this raises the question, how on earth could that happen? And it has been, of course, the usual explanation that the world is being created by God. In Christian and Catholic theology, it is said that God creates the world out of nothing. And I want to emphasize the point, in all fairness to Catholic and to Islamic and to Jewish doctrine, that it doesn't merely teach that God once upon a time started the world and set it going like you would wind up a machine and then leave it alone. All these three religions teach that God is always creating the world out of nothing now and willing it by his divine energy into being at this moment. But now the difficulty for us all, I think, especially for educated people in the modern world, is that the old-fashioned idea of God has become incredible or implausible. That is to say, in church or in synagogue, we seem to be addressing a royal personage. The layout of a church or of a synagogue looks like a royal court. There is some sort of throne, and we address prayers and requests to the being represented by the altar or the throne or the tabernacle as if that being were a king and were causing this universe in his royal, omnipotent, and omniscient wisdom. But then when we take a look through our telescopes and microscopes, or even when we go out in the forest and look at nature, we have a problem. Because the idea of God that we get from the Holy Scriptures, the Bible, the Quran, doesn't quite seem to fit the sort of world around us that we see, in just the same way as you wouldn't dream of ascribing a composition by Stravinsky to Bach. The style of God venerated in church, mosque, and synagogue seems completely different from the style of the natural universe. And it's so hard to conceive the author of the one as the author of the other. And furthermore, it strikes most intelligent people that our traditional religious ideas of God are too primitive. It seems impossible to think that this universe could have been authored by the naive idea of God as a sort of old gentleman who lives far above the stars in heaven, seated on a golden throne and adored by legions of angels. That seems a concept almost unworthy of the sort of universe that modern science has revealed to us. In other words, here's a picture of God. A friend of mine, Richard Borst, photographed this in a church just south of Oaxaca in Mexico. And it shows a very primitive Indian Catholic imagination of God the Father wearing a triple crown like the Pope, only he's rather young and handsome. He's not quite the old gray-bearded man, the Ancient of Days, but there is a serious idol, Christian idol, of God the Father Almighty. And so certainly that has become implausible. but also for many people it has become implausible that the root of the universe, which the theologian Paul Tillich calls the ground of being, that the root of the universe can be in some way a person to whom we can relate in just the same way that we relate to other people, and furthermore, a person who cares about us. In the words of Jesus, 5 sparrows are sold for a farthing, but yet not one of them falls to the ground without the Father knowing it. So realize that you are of more value than many sparrows. In other words, God cares a great deal more about you. But it just baffles our imagination that there could be this sort of person who cares about each one of us, who is totally aware of every single thing that we are and that we do, and by virtue of being aware of us, creates us. Of course, one thing that is difficult about the idea is that it's embarrassing. We do not feel comfortable if we are watched all the time by an infinitely intelligent judge. You know how it is in school. When you're a child and you're working at some exercise, and the teacher walks behind your desk and looks what you're doing. Now, even if you like the teacher very much, you feel put off by being watched, and it makes you self-conscious and awkward. And so in the same way, many people opt for atheism because they don't want that uncomfortable feeling that they're being watched all the time. It's awkward. And if I were God, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't want to embarrass my creatures in that way. And so I would leave them alone for a lot of the time. In fact, I've often thought about this whole thing. The kind of God that people worship is, of course, an attempt to imagine an absolutely perfect human being. But it's a very poor attempt. For example, Jesus taught that if somebody sins against you, you forgive him. And his disciples asked, well, how many times do you forgive him? And he said 99 times, which is our way of saying umpteen times. Always forgive somebody who sins against you. But notice that that is required of a saint. A saint is always forgiving, but it's not required of God. God will not forgive you unless you apologize. And you have to grovel on the ground if you've committed what the Catholic Church calls a mortal sin. You've got to come to God in a state of great penitence, and if you don't do that, you are liable to be confined in the dungeons of the court of heaven, commonly known as hell, for always and always and always. Now, I don't think that's a very nice kind of fellow. I mean, you wouldn't invite that sort of God to dinner, because he would embarrass everybody. Everybody would be sitting on the edge of their chair, you know, feeling like this. And God would be looking at you in such a way that you felt you were being seen through and through, that all your awful past, all your falseness and lack of authenticity would be completely perceptible to him. And though he understood it, and though he forgave it, he would nevertheless make you feel absolutely terrible. Well, you just wouldn't want that sort of company at dinner. You may think it's frivolous of me to say this, but don't forget that the pictorial image of God that people have in the backs of their minds, even if you're a very sophisticated philosopher or theologian, that primitive pictorial image has a very strong influence on your feelings about religion, about the universe, and about yourself. So it's just for that reason that the traditional idea of God has become implausible to many people, and that modern Protestant theologians and even some Catholics have been talking recently about the death of God and about the possibility of whether we could have a religionless religion. That is to say, a religion which does not involve belief in God. What, in other words, would become of the gospel of Jesus Christ, if it were shown that Jesus' own belief in God were unnecessary and invalid? What would remain of his teaching, of his ideas about caring for other human beings, about social responsibility, and so on and so forth, if the idea of God simply evaporated? Now, I think that's a pretty wishy-washy kind of religion. I mean, if you're going to say that this life is fundamentally nothing but a pilgrimage from the maternity ward to the crematorium, and that's it, baby, you've had it, I think that indicates a singular lack of imagination. I would like to look at the death of God theology in an entirely different way. I would like to say that what is dead is not God, but an idea of God. A particular conception of God has died in the sense of becoming implausible. And I find this a very good thing. Because, well, it's a principle of Jewish theology and later of Christian theology that it is always a mistake, even a sin, if you want to call it that. And I want to interpolate something here.